Welcome back to Live from Occupy City Hall. My name is Leslie Rolfe. I'm a member of the May 30th Alliance, and today we're going to have a discussion about the murder of Mark Barmore by Rockford Police Department officers Oda Poole and Stan North. Officer North reported that once he saw Poole and Barmore were struggling over Officer Poole's gun, he, quote, instantly realized this had now turned into a life or death situation for Officer Poole, myself, and possibly the children in the room if Barmore was allowed to get Officer Poole's pistol, end quote. Officer North reported that as he waited for Officer Poole to get out of his line of fire, he heard Officer Poole's gun discharge. Officer North reported that he did not know who had fired the gun, who had been hit, or who was in control of the gun. Officer North reported that as Barmore's right rear side faced him, he aimed at Barmore's back and fired what he believed to be 3 or 4 rounds, striking Barmore's back. Officer North reports that Barmore fell to the floor, landing on his back, and that water from a pipe near the sink began spraying. At this point, according to Officer North, there was now a lot of screaming from the children, who were now huddled in the far northeast corner of the room with the adults. As individual officers arrived on the scene, Officers North and Poole, quote, began yelling for the adult daycare workers to get the children out of there, end quote. Officer Hansel, one of the first officers arriving on scene, placed handcuffs on Barmore without moving him. Officer Hansel reported that Barmore was, quote, breathing in very ragged breaths that had several seconds between them, end quote. Officers called for an ambulance within approximately 1 minute after shots were fired. The church where the shooting occurred is across the street from a fire station, and emergency personnel were able to respond within moments of being called. Emergency personnel reported finding Barmore on his back in the kitchen area, not moving, not breathing, and pulseless. Emergency personnel asked permission from an officer to move Barmore from behind the counter to provide more room to work on him, and were given permission by the officers to move Barmore. Barmore was pronounced dead by emergency personnel while on the scene of the shooting. The events described above, from the moment Officers North and Poole saw Barmore in front of the church to the time they discharged their weapons, shooting and killing him, occurred in more than just 2 minutes. The forensic evidence is consistent with Officer Poole's and North's assertion that Officer Poole and Barmore were in close proximity when Officer Poole's weapon was fired, supporting the assertion that Officer Poole and Barmore were struggling over the weapon. The nature of the injury to Barmore's neck, the trajectory of the bullet, analysis of blood patterns, the presence of Barmore's DNA inside the ejection port of Officer Poole's gun, and the identification of DNA that may have been Poole's underneath Barmore's fingernails are all evidence that Barmore was shot at close range. A witness statement that Barmore stated as he was running downstairs that, quote, he was not going to go back, end quote, or words to that effect, indicating a mindset more likely to engage in struggle rather than surrender. In addition, on-scene field notes by the sergeants who separately interviewed Officers North and Poole immediately after the shooting while still at the church indicate that the officers' first counts of the events given minutes after the shooting were materially consistent with their later written supplement reports provided to RPD a few days after the incident ensued. This evidence indicates that there was a struggle over Officer Poole's weapon, and Officer Poole shot Barmore from close proximity, 2 feet or less, during this struggle. Officer Poole and Officer North stated that Barmore's hands were on Officer Poole's weapon during the struggle, and at the moment the weapon was fired. Upon examination of Poole's weapon, a spent cartridge casing was located lodged in the chamber, consistent with interference with the weapon while being fired. Gunshot residue analysis did not reveal gunshot residue on Barmore's hands, and Barmore's fingers or handprints were not found on Officer Poole's weapon. The lack of gunshot residue or prints, however, does not preclude the possibility that Barmore's hands were on Officer Poole's weapon when it was fired. GSR is not always found, even when it is known that a hand was on a weapon when it was fired. The evidence is consistent with Officer North's statement that he shot Barmore because he heard a shot and did not know whether Officer Poole had been shot and did not know who had control of Officer Poole's weapon. The forensic evidence is consistent with Officer North's statement that he shot Barmore as Barmore's right rear side faced him, aiming at Barmore's back and firing what he believes to be 3 or 4 rounds, striking Barmore in the back. 4 cartridge casings from Officer North's gun were found. 3 of the wounds to Barmore were found to have come from Officer North's weapon. The 4th wound to Barmore was a neck wound consistent with the bullet fired from close range by Officer Poole's weapon. The trajectories of the wounds caused by bullets from Officer North's weapon, as well as analysis of blood patterns and other forensic evidence, are consistent with Officer North's description of Barmore falling and turning as he was shot. The 4th bullet appears to have struck the water pipe of the sink in the, quote, kitchen area, end quote, resulting in water spraying the area until the water to the pipe was turned off. Other than possibly the children in the basement, the only apparent civilian witness to Officer Poole's shooting of Barmore said in the written statement she gave to RPD the day of the incident that she saw Barmore come out of the boiler room with his hands up and saw one officer shoot Barmore from about 3 or 4 feet away. The witness states she then stepped out of the doorway and heard 2 or 3 additional gunshots after that. This formal statement is consistent with the information she gave to an officer while still on scene, moments after the shooting. Later media reports quote this witness as stating that, quote, the officer shined his flashlight into the boiler room and told him to come out. He came out with his hands up. He came out real slow with his hands up and his head down, and they shot him. He fell over into the sink. He tried to get back up, and they shot him again. A heavy-set officer was the one who was shooting him while he was on the ground, end quote. The witness's initial statement to police is at odds with Officer North's and Poole's version of events in some respects, and consistent with their version of events in other respects. Consistent with the forensic evidence, this witness saw an officer and Barmore facing each other and saw the officer fire 1 time. Also consistent with the evidence, this witness heard 3 shots after she backed away from the door. The witness's perception of the distance between the officer and Barmore may be consistent with the forensic evidence depending upon whether the witness's statement that the officers were, quote, about 4 feet away, end quote, from Barmore meant 4 feet from person to person or from gun to person. The forensic evidence regarding the trajectory of the initial shot does not appear to be consistent with this witness's statement. This witness's later reported statements to the media are significantly different than her initial statements to police and are not supported by the forensic evidence. A second civilian witness, according to her written statement, stated that she did not see the shooting, but that she heard 4 gunshots and then turned to see an officer with his gun pointed in a downward position. Later media reports assert that this witness stated that officers, quote, fired as many as 8 rounds into Barmore, including at least 1 shot into his head, end quote. The forensic evidence is consistent with this witness's initial written statement, but not with later media reports. RPD policy authorizes an officer to use deadly force, quote, to protect himself or others from what he reasonably believes to be an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, end quote. A preponderance of the currently available evidence indicates that at the moment deadly force was used by Officers North and Poole, the use of that force was consistent with RPD policy. However, as detailed below, the actions of Officers North and Poole leading up to the shooting violated RPD policy and were not consistent with RPD training or sound tactics. The officers' handling of this incident placed the officers and numerous civilians, including young children, at increased risk of serious harm. So we're going to end this episode of Live from Occupy City Hall, the murder of Mark Barmore, on that note. That is the details of what took place on the day when Mark Barmore was murdered. We are going to return tomorrow with an episode discussing alternative options that could have been chosen to preserve Mark Barmore's life and to talk about some of the things that took place in the aftermath of Mark Barmore in the city of Rockford, Illinois.